I don't want to start it yet.
Okay.
Oh, look at you. You're like a pro.
Does it look good?
That's awesome. So what you want to do is go to slideshow on your PowerPoint presentation, and then push from the beginning, and it should there it goes. Yes. So that's what the audience will see.
Okay. And
And
are
then
you still able to see my video?
I see you.
Okay, good. And how can I minimize the little control panel?
So on the control panel, there's the orange arrow,
Mm-hmm.
and you just,
Oh, it
it's
just
just,
says hide?
yeah, the only way is to shut it off or to open it.
Okay.
But for the most part, Brenna, you should be able to not have that open because I will do all the background work.
Mm-hmm.
But just so you know kind of where that's at, you can generally, and what that will show you, if you want to keep it open, I generally have it closed just because for my screen it's too big, because you can't really control the size. You can't make it smaller or bigger. It just is that one size, and it seems kind of big. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight's webinar. I'm really excited about our webinar that our intern Brenna Schmetter has put together for us, and she has a lot of amazing information. So I know all of you will really enjoy getting to know her and also the information that she has put together for you. We do have several handouts that she will be talking about. That's in the handout section. So I would encourage all of you to download those handouts before you end the webinar so that you have an opportunity to use those handouts and pass those along to your families, and also just for your own general information. Today will be an hour-long presentation, and we will have continuing education certificates that I will send out within 48 hours of the completion of tonight's webinar. In order to receive a certificate, we do need to have everyone participate in the polls, and also at the end of the webinar, a survey will pop up on your screen. The survey does need to be completed in order for us to verify that you were in attendance to receive your certificate. So if you could just take a couple minutes to complete that survey at the end as well. Just a couple other housekeeping issues. There is a questions tab. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask those questions, and we will get to those by the end of the webinar. So anything that comes up that you have any questions about, if you can't hear us, if there's anything that just arises, please feel free to ask those things in the questions box. So tonight, I'm going to turn this over to Brenna, and for any of you who have any questions and do not receive your certificate within 48 hours, you can send me an email. Oftentimes, if you have not received a certificate from me in the past, they will go to your spam or your junk mail. So I do invite you to look in your spam or your junk mail prior to emailing me, since oftentimes that's where you can find it. So it will either come from the Nutrition Edge and go to webinar or Mary Lynn Cardell. So thank you so much for all spending the evening with us, and look forward to Brenna and her presentation. So thanks, Brenna.
Mary, can you see everything just fine?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, perfect. Oop. There we go.
You got it?
I believe so. My cat is acting up. So you can see everything just good?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty. First off, I want to thank you all for having me here today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about common underconsumed nutrients in kids, or otherwise titled as Nutrients Kids Need More Of. So we're going to talk briefly about fiber, vitamin D, some calcium, and iron. But before, oop, hey Mary, do you know how I advance the slides? Because it's not wanting to go.
It's not, sometimes you have to go onto your PowerPoint
Mm-hmm.
and then play it again, and then you should just be able to push your next button. You got it?
There we go. Yeah. Sorry about that, everyone. Before I dive into things, I want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Brenna. I'm the UNL dietetic intern, and I grew up in Bellevue, Nebraska, which is right next to Omaha. I got my undergraduate degree in nutrition and dietetics just recently, and I'm currently going to UNL to get my master's degree in nutrition. And so overall, the end goal is I want to become a registered dietitian, just like Mary. I'm not sure exactly what I want to do, but I figured I've got some time to figure it out. My hobbies are staying active. I love running out and walking outside now that the weather is super nice. I'm really enjoying that. I love cooking and playing with my cat. She is my little baby girl, and I got a picture of her down in the right-hand corner just because I think she's so cute. So, first slide. This is just a brief, broad overview, a summary of everything that we're going to talk about here today. We're going to talk about fiber, vitamin D, calcium, and iron. And within each of those topics, we're going to talk about their function, whether or not they have deficiencies, where they come from, or what foods they're in, as well as some real-world examples. So first, we're going to talk about fiber. So before I dive into that, what is fiber? It's probably something that you've heard of before. Maybe you've seen it on a nutrition facts label. And fiber is just a part of plants, a variety of plants, including grains, fruits and vegetables, legumes, which is a fancy word for like beans, peas, and lentils, as well as nuts and seeds. And so the thing about fiber, it's simply contained within each of these foods. Like, for example, in fruits and vegetables, it can be in the actual meat or the flesh of the fruit and vegetable. It can be in the peel, the seeds, or even the skin. But the catch about that is that oftentimes juice does not contain a lot of fiber. And that's why a lot of the times nutritionists and dietitians promote whole foods. So things like whole apples rather than things like apple juice because they have more fiber in them. So now we're going to talk about what fiber does. So just a quick summation of all of it. Fiber helps in weight control and reduce hunger. It benefits gut health as well as heart and diabetes health. So first, we're going to talk about weight control and reduced hunger. So how does fiber interplay with all of that? Well, first of all, fiber is non-digestible, so it doesn't break down very well in our stomach and in our intestines. So instead, what fiber does, fiber it bulks up the stomach and it absorbs a lot of water, and that makes fiber move a little bit slower through our digestive tract, and so that's what helps us feel fuller for longer. It also helps with gut health. So fiber is called, another word for it is it's a prebiotic, which means it's food for your gut bacteria, which is just microorganisms in your gut that keep you keep you healthy and happy. Don't think that bacteria is just all a negative thing. There are good gut bacteria in our intestines that do keep us healthy And so fiber in the gut helps us absorb vitamins and minerals. It keeps our intestines clean, like we mentioned. Since it's non-digestible, it helps remove a lot of those dead cells, digestive food, and any other debris in our intestines to keep them nice and clean. And it also keeps us regular. It helps prevent both diarrhea and constipation, and just overall helps us keep a healthy digestive tract. Lastly, it benefits our heart health, and it also benefits diabetic health. So how it helps our heart health. So fiber plays a role in lowering cholesterol, and it does this by binding to cholesterol and helping it be repurposed in our bodies rather than being deposited in our blood vessels, which are things those blockages when cholesterol builds up in our vessels can lead to just poor heart health in general. So fiber helps remove some of that cholesterol and keep our circulation really open and helps keep our heart pumping. And so next on to diabetic health. So fiber balances blood sugar, and it does this because, as I mentioned before, since it's hard to break down, it slows the breakdown of food and fiber and the absorption of food. That way our blood sugar isn't like super low and it's not super high. And so it helps insulin be released sort of in like on a constant level, and like I mentioned, it helps our blood sugar stay at like a normal level rather than going too high or too low. Next, we're going to talk about fiber deficiencies and if there is such a thing as a fiber deficiency. So overall, there is not technically a fiber deficiency, but the thing about that is fiber is still really beneficial for your health. And so just like we reviewed the functions of fiber, if you don't get a lot of fiber or no fiber at all, it can kind of do the opposite. So someone who doesn't consume a lot of fiber might have difficulty with weight control. They might be frequently hungry or not feel super full all the time. They may also have something called dysbiosis, which is just like a fancy scientific word for our gut bacteria imbalance. And it can cause irregular bowel movements. So we know that fiber keeps us regular, and if we don't have enough, it can cause irregularities like constipation and diarrhea, which is not fun. And lastly, a fiber, not technically deficiency, but if you don't get enough of fiber, it may increase your risk or worsen conditions of things like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, as well as cancer. So to summarize that up, while there isn't a fiber deficiency, it's still a really beneficial thing that we all want to consume. Next, we're going to talk about fiber sources and where we can find fiber in our foods. So the top 3 sources include things like fruits, vegetables, as well as whole grains. So before I dive into the sources, we're going to take a look at how much fiber kids should get. And so based on the 2020 to 2025 USDA dietary guidelines that just came out, they recommend that half of our grains should be whole grains. And I'll go into more detail on what whole grains are. But as you can see on our graph here up at the top with the pink and blue colors, the recommended amount for kids anywhere from 1-year-old to 13-year-old, those bars are pretty high. And when you compare them to the little pink bars, that is the actual intake of these age groups. And so if you compare the two, that pink bar is not meeting the recommended amount. So it's about half on each of those. So kids aren't getting enough fiber in their diets. And so to dive into how much they should actually be getting, it depends on their age group. There's not a one size fits all. And so in order to figure out how much fiber an infant or a child should get, it's about 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories, which, just estimating, the range is from about 19 to 28 grams per day. for children, just depending on their age, as you see in this graph here. But the caveat to that, while it would be really nice to just overnight consume tons more fiber or choose more high fiber snacks throughout your day, you kind of want to be a little bit cautious with that, especially with kids. I know that their stomachs can be a little bit sensitive, and if you increase your fiber intake very quickly, that might cause some gastrointestinal upsets. You might experience things like bloating. You're just not going to feel very good. So what you want to do, you still want to choose those high fiber options, but just slowly introduce them into your diet, as well as making sure that you're getting enough water throughout the day to sort of offset that high fiber intake. So next, moving on to fiber sources. So we know we've got our top 3 fiber sources. We've got fruits, veggies, and we've got our grains. So this simply breaks down how many grams are in each serving of whatever food group is here listed on the left-hand side. So we've got some very popular fruits with kids and adults in general. We've got some apples, oranges, bananas. They're all about like 3 to 4 grams of fiber per serving, or like per whole fruit. That's quite a bit of fiber. Moving on to vegetables, we can see that both like baked beans and green peas, which are both legumes because they're part of our bean, peas, and lentils family, they both have about, 7 to 4 grams of fiber per serving. And when we compare that to our fruit, that's actually a lot of fiber. So legumes are high in fiber, they're fiber packed, and as well as other vegetables as well, including things like broccoli, carrots, and even some potatoes. And while they don't have as much fiber as legumes, they're still very good options to get a good fiber source in. And lastly, we've got grains. And so on the top here, we've got a Fiber One cereal, which is really high in fiber. We can see that half a cup is about 13 grams per serving, which is the highest amount we've got on here. Next, move on to the frosted mini wheats. That still has quite a bit of fiber in it, as well as oatmeal. But the last couple, I think about the 6 on here, what I want you all to compare is we've got 3 different types of Cheerios. We've got the regular Cheerios, we've got multi-grain Cheerios, and we've got our Honey Nut Cheerios. So if we look at the top Cheerios, just the plain one, which is 100% whole wheat, that has the most fiber in it. And it's got a comparable amount to the multi-grain Cheerios, which has, both of them have 3 grams of fiber per serving. But if you look at the Honey Nut Cheerios, it doesn't have as much fiber as both the Cheerios and the multi-grain Cheerios. And so moving on, just another good example, looking at whole wheat bread versus multi-grain bread versus white bread. So we can see that the whole wheat bread here at the bottom, it has the most fiber with 2 grams per serving, whereas the multi-grain doesn't have quite as much, but it does have more than the white bread, which is at 1 gram per serving. And we'll go more into depth on why some of these things have more fiber than other items.
Brenna, there is a question. And the question is, how much would they need to get the ideal fiber amounts? Would it be 1 fruit and 1 veggie at each meal, or would they need more?
It depends on the age of the child, but I would say as just a general recommendation, it's always good to get at least 1 serving of both fruits and vegetables during every meal. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think that's a great answer. And I think also, just kind of assessing some of these foods are going to have higher amounts of fiber. And so really kind of encouraging a variety of some high fiber great foods at each of your in your meal planning, I think would be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And there's
I would second that.
a question, and that was just from Rachel about, is this where we sign in? And yes, once you sign in and log on to the webinar, I have all your contact information and you are registered into the webinar, and we will have your email and everything that we need to send your certificate and verify. So that's it.
Good, Mary? Okay. So now we're going to take a look at high versus low fiber food sources. So if we take a look at the top here, we've got pretty much a whole apple, and it's got the skin on it. That has 4 grams of fiber in the whole apple. But if we look at apple juice, like we had mentioned before, juice doesn't have a ton of fiber in it just because a lot of the parts of the fruit has been taken out to make the juice. We can see here on the right-hand side, this apple juice doesn't have any fiber in it at all. And that doesn't mean that apple juice is a bad choice, but it just means it's not as high in fiber as like a whole apple would be. And similarly, if we look here at the middle, we've got bread, the 100% whole wheat versus the bread, the white bread. And so we can see that the 100% whole wheat bread has double the amount of fiber as the white bread. And so the 100% whole wheat bread would be a better option to get more fiber in. And similarly with the brown rice versus the white rice, and if we take a look here at the bottom, we know that legumes, beans, peas, and lentils, they're very high in fiber. So if you make chili with beans, 1 cup of that has about 7 grams of fiber, which is quite a bit of fiber. But if you make chili without beans, if it's just meat, then it only has about 3 grams of fiber. So not as much. Okay, now we're going to talk about whole grains. So what's the difference between something that's like 100% whole wheat or whole grain versus something that's white? So the difference is that whole grains have 3 layers to them. So they've got bran, the endosperm, and the germ. And so we can see in this little picture here, the bran is the outside kind of brownish layer, and it's got a lot of fiber in it. And if we move one inwards to the tannish area, that's the endosperm, and that's the starchy part of the grain, and that serves as energy or food for the grain when it's growing. But fun fact, the endosperm is the part of the grain that white grains or refined grains keep, and these white grains remove both the germ and the bran. So that's why some of these white grains are lower in fiber, because it removes both the bran and the germ. And so wrapping it up, getting to the germ, that little circle that's a darker brown color, the germ is nutrient dense because it's high in a lot of really good fats, vitamins, and minerals. And so some quick examples to put that into perspective and something that is a little bit more tangible. So on here in this green column at the left where it says whole grains that may not say whole grain, so not every product or item or packaging needs to say whole grain for this specific column. So oatmeal doesn't need to say whole grain because it's already a whole grain, no matter how it's packaged. Same thing with brown rice. If it says that it's brown rice, it doesn't need to say whole grain because brown rice is a whole grain. And we've got a couple more examples here too. We've got things like popcorn, quinoa, amaranth, buckwheat, as well as bulgur. But where it gets a little bit tricky is this middle column that's more of like the yellow greenish color. So these are the grains that should say whole grain in order to be a whole grain. So you want to opt for things like whole grain or whole wheat flour, whole grain rye flour, whatever it may be. Other things on the list here, you want to make sure that it says whole grain like couscous or millet. And so on the opposite end of the spectrum, these would be the choices that are lower in fiber because they're not whole grains. If it simply says wheat or enriched flour or like all-purpose flour, if it says that it's multi-grain, that doesn't technically mean that it's whole grain. if it says degerminated, stone ground, semolina, or hurled. So if any grains that are listed just as such without saying whole grain, they're likely to be a little bit lower in fiber. So it's just a little bit tricky, and I like to refer back to this graph to just make sure that the choices that I'm choosing are high in fiber and that they're actually whole grain. All right, moving on. So sometimes when I look at packaging, there's a lot of eye-catching stuff on it, but sometimes I notice things where, for example, like a cereal will say like it's a good source of fiber. And I think to myself, well, what does that mean? What is a good source of fiber? And so we've got the numbers here. It's about 10 to 19% of the daily value. And that's just how much you get in a day, or how much that's recommended that you get in a day. And so the recommended amount is about 2.5 to almost 5 grams per serving in order for it to be a good source of fiber. So we've got our grape nut flakes here. This is the box that says it's a good source of fiber. And if we take a look at the nutrition facts label here on the right, in this little red box towards the bottom, we can see that the dietary fiber says 3 grams. So that falls within our 2.5 to less than 5 range, and we know that that is a good source of fiber. Similarly, what's the difference between good and an excellent source of fiber? So an excellent source of fiber has 5 grams or more fiber per serving. And so as opposed to the grape nut flakes, this is just the original grape nuts. And so grape nuts are an excellent source of fiber because if we look at our nutrition facts label here, in this little red box on the right, we can see that one serving has about 7 grams of fiber. So that falls within our 5 grams or more range in order to be an excellent source of fiber.
Can
All
I
right.
interrupt you, Nick? I'm
Yes,
sorry. There was a
no,
question.
you're okay.
If quinoa was on the CACFP whole grains, and it is a CFCP whole grain, it's credible as a whole grain for your quinoa. It is a whole grain. It's a high protein whole grain.
Good?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Alrighty. So we're going to compare and contrast the difference between something that's 100% whole grain and something that's made with whole grains. And so on the left here, we've got our Sara Lee bread. It's 100% whole wheat bread. And we can see that the first ingredient is whole wheat flour. So we know that's a good option or a good source of fiber. As we can see, one slice has about 2 grams of fiber. But if we look at the right-hand side at our other loaf of bread, which is white bread made with whole grain, the catch about made with whole grain is that they can put whole grain wherever they want in that ingredient list in whatever amount. So they don't have to put a ton of whole grain in it. They could, just as an example, put like a pinch in and say that, oh, it's made with whole grain. And so looking at our ingredient list here, we can see that the first ingredient is enriched wheat flour, the second is water, and then the third is whole wheat flour. So the whole wheat flour, the flour that we want that's high in fiber, that's the third ingredient, whereas our 100% whole wheat is the first ingredient, which that's what we want to aim for, because this 100% whole wheat loaf has double the amount of fiber per slice, because we can see this white bread only has 1 gram of fiber as opposed to 2 grams. Alrighty, so now we're going to take a look at good choices that are high in fiber. So we know we've got our top 3, we've got our fruits, our vegetables, and our grains. And so all fruits and vegetables are high in fiber. I've got a variety of different colors here. These little like fun kebabs, I thought that they were nice to look at. And so can't forget about our beans either. So our legumes, our beans, peas, and lentils. We've got some black beans here and even some chickpeas. And so going more into depth on the fruits and vegetables, Both the fruits and vegetables are best eaten if they have the skin on them, if any. So, for example, a whole apple is higher in fiber than applesauce because applesauce has that skin or that peel taken away. Similarly, a baked potato is higher in fiber than a potato that might be peeled, or things like French fries. It doesn't have that skin on it, so it's not as high in fiber, unfortunately. And to go over it again, 100% juice, even though it does, and it can provide a lot of vitamins and minerals, it does not have very much, if any, fiber at all. So those high fiber choices are our fruits and vegetables, our beans, and our whole grains, which are on the next slide. Alrighty, so I've just got a variety of different examples of whole grain or whole wheat options. Just a little bit of detail, wheat is just a type of grain, so both whole grain and whole wheat are good options. We've got our Cheerios because they're made with 100% whole grain oats. We've got our frosted mini wheats, some oatmeal, bran flakes. We've got our 100% whole wheat bread, rice, tortillas, and even some pasta. Alrighty, our first poll question. Mary, let me know when we're ready.
Can you see it? Which of the following is an example of a high fiber food? All right, I'm going to close the results. So there
Mary,
are.
do you want me to look at the results or are you going to read them off?
Can you see them or not?
I cannot currently, and I'm afraid if I click anything, I'll mess
Thank
what
you.
I
Yeah,
got going on.
I will read the results. So
Okay, great.
which of the following is an example of a high fiber food? And 73% got the right answer, which is pear slices. And so look, that's right. Pear slices are going to be our correct answer with that. And do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Yes, so we know that we've got 3 high fiber foods. We've got our fruits, our vegetables, and those whole grains. So pear slices would be a good high fiber option because that's part of our food group.
And having the slices with the skin on them is going to add that extra fiber.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Good to go?
Yep, ready to go.
Alrighty, so now we're going to talk a little bit about vitamin D. So what does vitamin D do? Well, it helps our body function properly and it works alongside calcium. So to go more in depth on that, like I mentioned, vitamin D and calcium work together. So they work together through an organ called the parathyroid gland, which don't need to memorize that. I just wanted to throw it in there. It's an organ kind of around our throat, and it simply helps regulate calcium levels in our body. So it helps to increase calcium absorption. It helps calcium function properly. It helps it get around our body, and it helps break things down and helps things just move smoothly throughout our body. And so the thing about vitamin D and calcium is that it's best when they're consumed together. Moving on to body and organ function. I won't go super into depth to these, but vitamin D helps with bone building process. It helps manage our blood pressure, insulin secretion so that our blood sugars can be stable. It helps with immune regulation so we can stay healthy and not get sick. And it helps our liver, kidney, pancreas, colon, and skin function properly. Alrighty, now we're going to talk about vitamin D deficiency. So unlike fiber, which doesn't technically have a deficiency, vitamin D does, and it results in decreased bone quality. So a vitamin D deficiency in kids will result in brittle bones, or a condition called rickets, which is often characterized by bowed legs when the knees sort of point outwards rather than being straight. And rickets can cause a developmental delay. And if someone has a vitamin D deficiency over their lifespan, that can result in osteoporosis, which is simply just brittle bones in older age. And so they're more prone to things like bone fractures and bone breaks. And so in some severe cases of vitamin D deficiency, there can be some bone deformities or dental abnormalities. Kids can also experience things like pain, seizures, spasms, and the heart has difficulty pumping blood. That's just in very, very severe cases. Alrighty, so now we're going to talk about vitamin D sources. So it's a little bit different from fiber. Both seafood, dairy, and a couple other different types of foods are high in vitamin D. So before we dive into it, we just want to take a look at the recommended intake. And again, don't feel like you have to memorize this. This is just a good reference. Infants from 0 to about 1 year old should intake about like 10 micrograms, and any infant or child older than a year to about 18 years should intake about 15 micrograms. That's just a reference. Again, don't feel like you have to memorize that. And to note, milk and dairy products are not appropriate for children under 1 year old. So giving milk to an infant is not appropriate at that age group. Alrighty, so diving in. So we know that our top 3 sources of vitamin D, we've got seafood, dairy, and other. And so I'll go more into detail about that. So for seafood, we've got a variety of different fish. We've got like things like trout, salmon, sardines, and even tuna. And so all of those things are fairly high in vitamin D. We've got dairy, which some of you may be familiar with as high in vitamin D because it's fortified. And so like a cup of 2% milk has about 120 IUs per serving, as well as cheddar cheese being kind of high in vitamin D. But the other group is something that I want to talk about more specifically. I know other is kind of vague. It's not very descriptive, just because it's here or there. So some foods can be fortified with vitamin D, kind of like milk. A lot of the time cereals, like breakfast cereals, will be fortified with vitamin D. You just kind of have to check the nutrition facts label or to see if it says that it's fortified, as well as eggs. Eggs are high in vitamin D. But to note, down at the bottom, you can also get vitamin D from being out and about and outside on a sunny day and having your arms and legs exposed for about 15 minutes a day. And so that'll get you some vitamin D as well. And so some good choices high in vitamin D. So we've got those top 3. We've got our seafood, our dairy, as well as a couple other things like eggs. And so we've got a couple examples here. We've got some yogurt, some milk, cheese. We've got our eggs in the top right corner, as well as 2 seafood options. So here in the little reddish color, that's a can of salmon. And then on the bottom right, we've got that blue can, which is tuna. So all of these are very good options that are high in vitamin D. We've also got kind of the tricky part of vitamin D. So some of these foods listed on this screen, these are fortified foods. So what that means is that vitamin D does not naturally occur in these foods. It has to be added to them. So vitamin D is added to things like Cheerios and grape nuts, so those breakfast cereals. And it's also added to things like plant-based milk, so things like soy milk. But the catch with that, you got to check the nutrition facts label to make sure that it actually does have some vitamin D in it. And so if we check our nutrition facts label of this silk milk here, of the silk soy milk, we can see in this little red circle that it's got 3 micrograms of vitamin D. So it is fortified and it is a good source of vitamin D. So it gets a little bit trickier from here. So the nutrition facts label is based on adult nutrition and the average needs and recommendations for an adult. And we need to tailor that to child nutrition. So we need to calculate, if it didn't say 3 micrograms, we need to figure out, well, how much is 15%? And so the recommended intake for adults is 15 micrograms of vitamin D. So we're going to take that 15 micrograms and multiply it by the 0.15. That's the percentage of vitamin D that it's listed on the nutrition facts label. So we've got the micrograms times that 15%. And so that gives us the 2.25 micrograms. So that's about 3 micrograms, which is listed here on the label as well. But if it wasn't, that's kind of how you would calculate it out. And we know I've got, just for reference, I've got the table here of the recommended amount for both infants and children. Alrighty, so sunlight is also a good source of vitamin D. Like I'd mentioned, just getting outside, having your arms and legs exposed, running around for anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes, that'll get you enough exposure to vitamin D. So just to stress the importance of getting kids outside. I'm sure it's good to let them run out that energy too. But yeah, it's important to keep them physically active, not only so they can get that energy out, but so that they can get some vitamin D too. Alrighty, got another poll question.
I will launch the poll. I don't know if you can see the launch. Can you see the launch? All right, I'm going to close the poll. Everybody's voted, and I will share those results. So which of the following is an example of a food high in vitamin D? 81% said scrambled eggs, so that's awesome. That was 3% said grapes, 3% said ham sandwich, and 14% said mixed veggies. All right.
Alrighty, good to go, Mary?
Yep, back to you now.
Okay.
So it was 81% had scrambled eggs.
Okay. Alrighty, so now we're gonna move on to calcium. And calcium is important for just general body function. And I'll go into more depth to that. So body function, we know that both calcium and vitamin D work together. And so you might be familiar that calcium helps kids build strong bones, but it also helps with proper muscle and nerve function, circulation and heart health. And calcium is important for nutrient transport throughout our body. So it helps transport things like hormones, enzymes, proteins, some vitamins, and even some minerals. And like I'd mentioned, calcium and vitamin D work together. So it's best if you get sources of both calcium and vitamin D. All right, calcium deficiency. So similarly to a vitamin D deficiency, which results in decreased bone quality, calcium is a little bit more unique and it's not identical to vitamin D. So a calcium deficiency also results in numbness. Alrighty, so calcium deficiency, like I'd mentioned, results in decreased bone quality. Similar to vitamin D, it can result in rickets, brittle bones, and osteoporosis, which all of those things increase the risk of a bone fracture or a bone break. But additionally, it can also result in just a scientific term, neuropathy, which is just a word for like numbness or tingling. Calcium deficiency in severe cases can also result in things like spasms and abnormal heart rhythms. All right, now we're going to talk about calcium sources. So our top 3 calcium sources, we've got dairy, vegetables, and fortified foods. So before we talk about those sources more specifically, I've just got the recommended intake for calcium. We've got infants 0 to 6 months, about 200 milligrams, on upwards to kids that are aged 9 to 13, which their recommended intake is about 1,300 milligrams. And as I had mentioned before, yes, we're going to talk about how milk is high in calcium, but milk is not appropriate for children under the age of 1. So we've got our top sources here. We've got our top 3. So we know that dairy, vegetables, and some fortified foods are high in calcium. So going into depth on dairy, any type of dairy, whether that's milk or a milk product, those are high in calcium. We can see that yogurt here is the highest in calcium at 415 milligrams per serving. Same with like the cheddar cheese and the milk. Cottage cheese isn't as high in calcium as yogurt and milk, but it's still got a substantial amount of calcium in it. So moving on to vegetables. While vegetables do contain calcium, they don't contain as much calcium as dairy does. But for some example, some vegetables that are high in calcium include things like cooked collard greens, cooked kale, soybeans, and even broccoli. And so down here at the bottom, we're going to take a look at fortified foods. So these are the foods that have to have calcium added to them. Not every food is going to contain calcium, so you've got to check the nutrition facts label to make sure that it does have some calcium in it. But some common calcium fortified foods include things like orange juice, even tofu, and some hot cereals, so things like oatmeal and cream of wheat. Okay, so some good choices that are high in calcium. We know that dairy and dairy products, milk, so things like yogurt, we've got our cheese and our milk. Those are all high in calcium, as well as some vegetables. And so what I like to remember, the vegetables that are high in calcium are leafy greens. So we've got a couple of different examples here. We've got some different varieties of kale. We've got things like bok choy, some Swiss chard. Oh gosh, what else do we have on here? Some romaine, some spinach, even some cabbage. Just a variety of those leafy greens, as well as some other green vegetables like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and even some soybeans. So to wrap it up, we've got milk and those milk products that are high in calcium, as well as those leafy greens, as well as soybeans that are high in calcium. And lastly, our fortified foods. And as it mentions here, you got to check the nutrition facts label just to make sure that it is fortified. Like I had mentioned, orange juice sometimes is fortified with calcium, and we can see on the left-hand side here, I've got that little yellow circle that says that it's fortified with calcium. Not all orange juice will be fortified with calcium, but some are. So you just got to check the label. Soy milk, the silk soy milk, is fortified with calcium, as well as our hot cereals. So we've got our example of oatmeal here. We can see that this oatmeal is fortified, and it's got 10% of our daily needs of calcium. And so, like we remember in the other example with the soy milk, the silk soy milk, we saw that the vitamin D content was in a percentage, and because the nutrition facts label is based on adult needs. We need to calculate it for children's needs. So how much is exactly 10%? So we know that the recommended intake for adults is about 1,000 milligrams of calcium. So we take that amount and multiply it by the percentage of calcium that's contained in this oatmeal. So it's 10%, which would be about 0.1. And so we multiply that by the 1,000 and we get 100 milligrams. So we know that this one serving of instant oatmeal has about 100 milligrams of calcium in it. And just as a good reference, I've got the recommended intake of calcium here too, just to give a good perspective. Alrighty, another poll question.
All right, so I'm going to launch the next poll. The next poll is, which of the following is an example of a food high in calcium? Ground beef, fortified orange juice, steamed corn, or multi-grain crackers? Just waiting for the last. All right. So we have the results. It looks like 95% said fortified orange juice, 3% said steamed corn, 3% said multi-grain crackers. And back to you.
All right. Okay, our last one, iron. We're almost wrapping it up. We're almost there. So, what does iron do for our bodies? Well, iron is beneficial for both muscle and brain function. So, going more into depth, motor and cognitive function. So, excuse me, geez. What that means, motor simply means movement, and cognitive is like our brain. It's anything that is mental. So iron helps with our movement and our brain health, and it also helps with oxygen transport throughout our bodies. And so, more into depth, iron is a part of red blood cells, and it's also a part of muscle cells. So it keeps us strong, it keeps our muscles strong, and our brain functioning. And now into iron deficiency. So an iron deficiency will result in developmental delay, as well as paleness and fatigue. So a little bit more about iron. Iron is actually the most common child nutritional deficiency worldwide, which is a fun fact that I wanted to include to just stress the importance of having kids intake an adequate amount of iron. And so there are two different types of iron deficiencies. The first type, the iron deficiency, just means low iron stores, and the iron deficiency anemia includes both the low iron stores as well as a low red blood cell count. So you don't need to memorize that, but just for your information. And as we had mentioned, because iron is good for motor and cognitive development, if we don't get enough, that might result in motor and cognitive developmental delays. And so, signs and symptoms of an iron deficiency. So an iron deficiency, or someone who has this deficiency, they might look pale, whether on their face or their hands. And one thing that I think is interesting, someone with an iron deficiency, their nails might be spoon-shaped. So if you think nails kind of are curved up and outwards, and it's got like a nice smooth feel to it, someone who has an iron deficiency, their nail is more so bowed inward. So if you think like a spoon shape, that's what their nail would look like. And someone with an iron deficiency might also just be generally like fatigued, tired, have trouble focusing, as well as a rapid heart rate. And so iron sources, we've got our top three again. So both fortified foods meat, and vegetables are all high in iron. So the recommended intake of iron varies just based on age. And the reason why it kind of goes up and down based on age group is just, it's dependent on the developmental stage of children and just based on their nutritional needs at their age. So we've got our top sources, our top three. We've got those fortified foods, we've got meat and vegetables. Those are all high in iron. And so with our fortified foods, this is the food where iron is added into things like breakfast cereals or tofu. So breakfast cereals are pretty substantially fortified in iron, and as you can see, some breakfast cereals contain an average of about 18 milligrams per serving. So got to check the nutrition facts label, but if it is fortified with iron, that can be a really good source of it. Moving on to meat, we've got a variety of different meat sources. All of them are fairly high in iron, including things like beef, chicken, turkey, pork, and fish. Those are all good sources of iron. And lastly, we've got some vegetables. So our legumes return. We've got our beans, peas, and our lentils. Those are all high in iron and can vary and range between like 1 to 3 milligrams per serving. And then some other like random vegetables like cooked spinach, canned tomatoes, and baked potatoes. Alrighty, good choices, high in iron. So we know we've got our meat that's high in iron, a variety of different types of meats, and some vegetables. And so this gets a little tricky. There's no easy way to remember which particular vegetables are high in iron. So I've got just an example of 3 here on the left. Legumes we know are high in iron. Some leafy greens, so things like spinach, kale, romaine, bok choy, whatever it may be. You know, our leafy greens are high in iron, as well as some random vegetables, like we've got our baked potato, for example, and canned tomatoes. And I've linked some sources here at the bottom, which are just good to refer to if you're not sure which vegetables are or are not high in iron. Lastly, our fortified foods. We remember to check that nutrition facts label to make sure that it is fortified. But oftentimes, a lot of breakfast cereals are fortified in iron. Just got to check the nutrition facts label. So we can see we've got our example here of Wheaties. Wheaties has 45% of daily value of iron. So to put that into perspective, we know that the nutrition facts label are based on adult needs. So how much iron does a serving of Wheaties actually contain? And so I've taken the average adult recommendation for iron, and I've taken the average of both of those. So that's about like 13 milligrams. And I'm multiplying that by the percentage of iron Wheaties contain. So that's about 45%. So we're multiplying that average of 13 times the 0.45. And so that means one serving of Wheaties has about almost 6 milligrams of iron in it. Alrighty, another poll question. I think this is the last one too.
All right, I'm launching. It is our last one. And the question is, which of the following is an example of a food high in iron? Cottage cheese, peaches, 3-bean salad, or whole wheat tortillas? All right, just waiting for one more, it looks like. Yep, there we go. And we can share the results. Which of the following is an example of a food high in iron? Looks like 8% said cottage cheese, 84% said 3-bean salad, and 8% said whole wheat tortilla. And the answer is the 3-bean salad.
That one is a little bit trickier. There we go.
So we just have another, Brenna, so I think you're kind of putting it all together for the next 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I'll just briefly run through these. So this is putting it into perspective what this information would look like on a day-to-day basis. And so we've got our CACFP meal planner. I've just got Monday, and so it lists the different foods for breakfast, lunch, and snack. And so we want to try to pick out which foods are high in fiber. We've got that top 3. We know that fruit, vegetables, and whole grains are high in fiber. And so trying to pick that out, we've got breakfast, our fruit, so our orange slices are high in fiber. And for lunch, we've got kiwi. And so then for vegetables, they're in both our lunches and our snacks with the stuffed spud. That's just based on the recipe. Potatoes are high in fiber because they're one of our vegetables, as well as any other veggies that may be in on that. For our snack, we've got carrots. And lastly, we've got some whole grains. So Kix is made with whole grain cornmeal, so that's a good option that's high in fiber, as well as lunch because we've got our whole grain breadstick. And maybe the mini rice cakes if it's made with brown rice, because we know that brown rice is a whole grain. Moving on to examples of vitamin D. So again, we've got our top 3 for vitamin D. We've got dairy, fortified foods, and seafood. So our dairy options for our Monday meal, we've got some dairy in the form of milk for breakfast, and we've got both milk and cheese for lunch recipe. And so taking a look at our fortified foods, as always, check the nutrition facts label. Kix does happen to be fortified with vitamin D. That's also a good source. But unfortunately, there's no seafood in this meal plan for this day, so not really an option, but we've got some other sources that are good sources of vitamin D.
I'm gonna have us stop there just so we can kind of respect everyone's time. So I appreciate everything that you presented today, Brenna. I think everybody probably learned a lot of new information. Once again, as we end the webinar, there look like there's no more questions. As we end the webinar, a survey will pop up. So please complete that survey. I would encourage you to download the handouts before you leave the webinar today so that you can utilize that for your centers as well as share them with your families. And as of course, the webinar certificates will be going out within 48 hours. Please check your spam or your junk mail if you do not receive that prior to reaching out to me. Generally, I will send them out within 24 to 48 hours, and sometimes they do go to junk or your spam folder. So once again, thanks so much for spending the evening with us. And Brenna, thank you so much for putting everything together and doing such an amazing job with gathering information that will help everybody who's in attendance. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.